Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I don't often hear all of my education recited out to me, and so it makes me realize, gosh, I've been doing this for a while, so thank you very much. Can you guys all hear me okay if I hold it like this? Yeah? Okay, good. So one of the things that I want to just kind of elaborate on a little bit further with my training is just the fact that I've really had the unique opportunity to work with a lot of patients with a variety of different developmental and medical disorders, and I'm really thankful for the lessons that they've shared with me. And today what we're going to talk about is a specific diagnosis called nonverbal learning disability. How many of you guys have heard about this diagnosis? Okay, so a fair amount of you guys have heard about it. For those of you who haven't, we are going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about this diagnosis. As some of you guys in the room are aware of, there's a fair amount of controversy behind this diagnosis in the field, and so I really do want to spend some time giving you guys tools and information as a family to help you understand how to advocate for your child and what hurdles you might come up against if you were to and you hear this diagnosis or use this diagnosis with your child if appropriate. So we'll talk about the history of nonverbal learning disabilities and where they came about. We'll talk about the assessment and the classification of nonverbal learning disability, some of the scientific issues and why there is some controversy in the field, and then we'll talk about some specific interventions. So regardless of whether or not the label is a label that we use, we do see a constellation of weaknesses. And so briefly, before we talk about some of the history, what I'd like to talk about, just what is nonverbal learning disability? What are we talking about when we use this term? The term, I think, can be a little confusing because you hear the word nonverbal and you think, does that mean they can't talk? But in fact, we actually see that these are individuals who have notable strengths in language skills. So the weaknesses that we tend to see are actually in visual-spatial skills and in mathematics. There's been the most empirical evidence to suggest that those are the two longest standing or most well-supported kind of areas of vulnerability. There's also some varying levels of evidence for weaknesses in motor skills, weaknesses in social cognition, emotional functioning, and attention and executive functioning. And again, this constellation of weaknesses is seen within the context of some notable strengths in language-based skills. So vocabulary development, language-based academics, those are things that these individuals tend to do quite well on. So when we think about these NLD cognitive profiles, we hear about them not only in Turner syndrome, but there's also been a number of other medical disorders where this cognitive profile has been identified. So looking at individuals with autism spectrum disorders, or what we used to call Asperger's, fetal alcohol syndrome, hydrocephalus, individuals who have received radiation treatment for oncology backgrounds, traumatic brain injuries, absence of the corpus callosum, the fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain, and then we also can see it in epilepsy or seizure disorders. Okay, so it's not just isolated to one specific population. It is, in fact, a cognitive profile that we can see in a variety of other medical disorders. So how did this term come about? So we first started talking about specific learning disabilities in the 1960s. And at that time, we really heard more information about verbal learning disabilities. So either reading and writing or speech language. And those tended to be the areas that we had the most concern about. In the 1970s, Michael Bust started talking about what was identified as the constellation of nonverbal learning disabilities. So really looking at what we consider a split, if you will, between verbal and performance IQ. So verbal IQ being your ability to define words, to tell me how two words are the same, and performance IQ being more like your ability to replicate visual information or recognize a sequence, what was happening in a sequence of pictures, and be able to predict what should come next. So really recognizing individuals who had a unique strength with verbal intellectual abilities. Also identified was handwriting difficulties, a poor concept of time, math weaknesses, difficulties with social relationship, things that we tend to think of as being associated with the right hemisphere. and also some difficulty negotiating nonverbal aspects of their environment. So many of the themes of that initial kind of description of the nonverbal learning disabilities have remained consistent over time. We did see some further research by Declan talking about poor spatial orientation, poor math understanding, social emotional deficits, and left-sided motor signs within the context of these higher level language skills. We saw in 1983 kind of this idea of a behavioral kind of syndrome. So talking really about identifying some specific weaknesses within the right hemisphere. So again, you guys may remember from kind of your high school biology class that the right hemisphere kind of controls the left side of our brain and the left side controls the right side. And we tend to think that each hemisphere of the brain is specially able to better handle certain things. So the left hemisphere tends to do a lot of language and the right hemisphere tends to do more nonverbal or visual spatial kind of reasoning skills. So really these researchers started to look at specific neurological diagnoses where we were seeing kind of this right hemisphere disorder, if you will. Voliere, again, kind of provided some further evidence for the idea of strengths with verbal reasoning and language-based academics within the context of weaker visual, spatial, and math skills, but also added some kind of concerns about inattention, but recognizing that there's a lot of variability in these presentations, that it wasn't as clear or as straightforward as we might have thought. Bruce Pennington did a little bit of work with visual spatial problems and kind of really identified the NLD kind of profile as including visual spatial problems, handwriting, math, and social cognition. And really this idea that verbal learning disabilities are based on low academic achievement, but how do we diagnose NLD, which is really kind of looking at impairments at a cognitive level, if you will. Oh, sorry, I forgot to bring it up there. All right, so one of probably the most prolific researchers in this area has been Rourke's model of NLD. And some of you guys, if you're familiar with NLD, you've probably heard this term before. But really, he identified this idea of assets and deficits. So things that children did quite well, including kind of early speech language development that seemed within normal age expectations, strengths in rote memory skills, attention to detail, language-based academic skills being at or above age expectations, so reading and spelling, and then recognizing that these children tend to be quite articulate, that they're able to really present as someone who has some really notable verbal strengths. Within this set of strengths, you also started to see he identified these specific areas of concern, so visual spatial skills. So specifically looking at visual perception. So visual perception really looks at this idea of how do you view the world, and are you viewing it the same way? So we look at kind of visual discrimination. So can you identify similarities between visual pictures? Can you replicate visual information? Really trying to get an idea of that. And then looking at visual recall. So if I show you a set of visual pictures, are you able to recognize or replicate those at a later time? Also looked at motor skills, so thinking about fine motor, what we consider or call graphomotor skills, so pencil control, handwriting, fine motor skills like getting dressed, buttoning, those kind of weaknesses. Overall coordination, so an individual's ability to navigate through their environment without bumping into a variety of things, or kind of what we would consider kind of clumsy behaviors. And then concerns about balance were another area that were noted to be a concern. And then this idea of social skills, so difficulty with nonverbal communication. So social judgment, being able to utilize nonverbal gestures, in understanding and interpreting facial expressions, those kind of weaknesses that were identified. And then the thought behind these kind of deficits was that those set of skills or those sets of weaknesses directly affected attention, memory, problem solving, and a child's kind of social competence. His model is really the one that has the most professional and lay impact, and is also the one that has the most theoretical or empirical support at this stage. Dr. Rourke also started working on kind of what we call the white matter hypothesis. In our brain we have two kind of major divisions that we talk about with gray matter and white matter. White matter is essentially the highways between the different areas of the brain. So it helps with communication between the different areas so that we're able to communicate and kind of share information across our brain. There tends to be a higher ratio of white to gray matter in the right hemisphere. And so it was really this thought that since there's more white matter, if there is dysfunction or damage or a lesion to that right hemisphere, that we're more likely to see those deficits associated with white matter disease. This is just, so this is kind of our standard kind of brain picture that we've always seen, right? And then this is some newer neuroimaging studies that are really allowing us to look at the white matter tracts within the brain. And so I just really like this picture because I think when I talk about white matter tracts as highways, it doesn't kind of come across as well with this picture. But really when you look at this, this is really the idea that we're seeing, that there are some really notable highways or communication tracts within the brain that can be potentially damaged with a variety of different medical diagnoses. So the prevalence for NLD, there is some controversy in this, but some of the early kind of research would suggest that within a population of children who have learning disabilities, so in a clinic for kids with learning disabilities, that they were seeing 5 to 10% of that clinic sample having a diagnosis of NLD. Some different research would suggest it was only 1%. So I think that there's some variability. I think you might be hearing higher numbers with some of the other research, but at this point, that's kind of the standard that people were thinking is within kids diagnosed with learning disabilities that NLD was happening at about 5 to 10%. So assessment methods, how do we tell if a child has a nonverbal learning disability? Early studies with Rourke and his colleagues really just looked at, did a child have a math disability? And that was the way that they diagnosed a nonverbal learning disability. That progressed to really people looking more holistically at a variety of different skills, so not only math, but also some of the other areas that we've talked about, so the visual spatial and some of the social cognition and kind of thinking about those. A lot of the research that you'll hear about, or the early research talked about this again, this verbal performance split, and using a cutoff of 10 points. So if your verbal IQ is 10 points higher than your performance IQ, really using that as a diagnostic criteria. The problem is that a lot of people in the general population have that split, that it's not considered significant or rare, if you will. And so that makes it a little bit more challenging to really say, gosh, that should be a diagnostic criteria when it can be so easily applied to other populations. We also see that that 10-point split isn't consistent across the lifespan. So 30% of kiddos who are 9 to 15 with NLD showed that 10-point split, but 70% of 7 to 8-year-olds did. So noticing that even using it as a diagnostic criteria with an individuals identified with NLD wasn't sensitive, if that makes sense. You guys holding in there with me okay? Yeah, all right, I know there's a lot of data and history. Hang in there, we're getting to the good stuff, okay? So over time, we really kind of expanded it to reflect this idea of assets and deficits. There was a proposal for ICD-9. So ICD-9 is kind of the diagnostic manual, if you will, that is used by the majority of the medical field to make consistent medical diagnoses. And so this was kind of the proposed criteria. So you can see some of the things that we've talked about in the past, as well as some additional new information. So tactile perception was looked at as having bilateral deficits. So bilateral just meaning both sides. And what this was saying is that that an individual has trouble with really understanding either what's being held in their hand or how their hand is being touched, if that makes sense. So just that their sensory or their ability to understand the touch that they're having isn't as effective or as intact as it might be for other people. Also talked about the kind of complex psychomotor coordination, which we've talked a little bit about, and again, that's just this idea of clumsy behaviors or behaviors that might be indicating some kind of gross motor weaknesses. We also see extremely impaired visual-spatial organizational skills. So again, that idea of being able to interpret and replicate visual information is something that we see as an area of potential concern. One of the other things that we can talk about a little bit is dealing with novel or complex information. So that was something that the authors of this proposal had indicated that kids seem to struggle more with situations where they had to really utilize information that was more appropriate in novel situations to help kind of stay on task. Impairments of novel problem solving. So we look at, I don't know if it's better this way or not, you guys, sorry. You know, having to use kind of planning and organizational strategies and being able to utilize that information and efficiently solve problems that they might not be as aware of. Can you guys still hear me okay? Okay, good. A distorted sense of time, so having just a misunderstanding of how much time has passed or how much time is left, really not being able to do that quite as well as we might expect for other people their age. And all, again, within this idea of a well-developed rote verbal abilities, being highly verbose, being able to chat it up, but not always understanding the pragmatics. So some of those kind of literal interpretations of statements like, hit the road, Jack, and some of those things that seem to be a little bit harder for people to understand who might have NLD. We also saw deficits in math within the context of those strengths in reading and spelling, and then difficulties in social perception and judgment, and a high risk for what's called internalizing behaviors or symptoms like anxiety and depression. So this is what was proposed to the ICD-9 for the ICD-9-10, which just was revised within the last year or so. And what we saw was that it was not accepted. So at this point, we have some scientific limitations with the use of the term nonverbal learning disability. So nonverbal learning disability is not widely recognized in the United States. It is not included, as I mentioned, in the ICD-10 or in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that is typically used by psychologists to consistently make diagnoses. Even within practitioners, you'll hear people talk about NLD or NVLD, depending on which coast you're on. So even within the field, I think we really struggle at being able to consistently title what this constellation of weakness is. It's not formally recognized outside of the US as well, although there tends to be some more acceptance at a clinical level. So there's some studies in Britain and Australia and Italy that have started to indicate that there might be some more research happening in these areas. The other kind of scientific limitation or clinical limitation is that schools don't recognize nonverbal learning disability. So if you take a report to a school district and you say, my child has a nonverbal learning disability, there's not a category for that label to be used on their IEP. So for those of you guys who may know, schools have offer special educational services to children who have disabilities, but they have to fit within this kind of criteria that's been developed at a federal level. And so these are the 13 categories that are used. And so oftentimes there's kind of the struggle of what do we do, how do we help serve these patients who might have these notable cognitive vulnerabilities, and how do we support them at school or advocate for them to be supported at school. So one of the ones that would make the most sense when we're talking about a nonverbal learning disability is a specific learning disability. But when you look at the actual criteria for a specific learning disability, what you're seeing, and I'm just going to read it quickly, is that it means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, or spell, or to do math calculations. So really, when you look at it, there's not a lot of range to say, gosh, that's a kiddo who has visual spatial weaknesses, or it's a kiddo who has a specific nonverbal learning disability. That's not included as a part of the description. And so from a clinical standpoint, these are patients who we see in clinic who have this set of weaknesses with nonverbal learning disabilities in terms of visual spatial weaknesses and kind of math reasoning, and how do we advocate for them. And we can talk a little bit about that in terms of interventions, but I think it is one of the main hurdles that we can come up against when people use that terminology. So why? Why is there this discrepancy? Why do we have these camps in the US of people who are really for the NLD diagnosis and people who are still hesitant about it? And the reason is because of some of the limitations in empirical or scientific literature. So we haven't been able to, as a field, really measure this diagnosis or this cognitive profile very well. Partly because of some of the limitations of the populations that have been studied. So a lot of times what we see is that early studies really were comparing kids with nonverbal learning disabilities to kids with verbal learning disabilities, so reading or dyslexia. We don't have a great consensus as a field on how to define or the criteria that's necessary for nonverbal learning disability, and so that makes it very challenging to replicate research. And as you guys know, one of our great kind of foundations of peer research is this idea that we can replicate it over and over again to prove that it's an appropriate diagnosis. There's also been kind of what we call methodological issues with previous research. So many of the studies haven't included kind of a, what they call a neurotypical or a control group. There hasn't been exclusionary criteria, so the study has involved a lot of other kiddos who might be at greater risk for neurocognitive weaknesses just based on their medical diagnosis. So kids who've had seizures or kids who've had traumatic brain injuries, which might not get us a clearer idea of what nonverbal learning disability might look like from a developmental standpoint. And we talked a little bit about the diagnostic criteria and then small sample size. So a lot of these studies are, have included a very, very small group of people, which again makes it very hard to generalize out into larger populations. So our research at this point has led us to a lot of different questions. So is nonverbal learning disability any different from just having a math learning disability? Or are the weaknesses that we see in visual constructional skills just part of having a math learning disability? What's the influence on attention on social perception? So is it that kiddos with some of these social skills really truly just have difficulties with attention and executive functioning skills? Is nonverbal learning disability any different from an autism spectrum diagnosis, or is that really a more appropriate diagnosis? And are there subtypes of nonverbal learning disability? So is this a true diagnosis, but that there's so much variability in the individuals that we've studied that maybe there really are different levels of this kind of diagnosis and a different set of weaknesses. But as you start to get into a very small population of kiddos, carving out subtypes becomes even more challenging, as you can imagine. So lots and lots of questions. And I think there's been a lot of kind of recent or more recent kind of conversation about this in the neuropsychological field, in which a lot of the neuropsychology kind of community has started to kind of challenge this nonverbal learning diagnosis as a, nonverbal learning disability as an appropriate diagnosis. And the idea behind some of the recent studies by Pennington and Riss and Nortz or Greigert was that is it really its own diagnosis? Or are we pulling together a number of different weaknesses and calling them one thing? And is that helpful? Or is it better to really recognize some of these other labels that are already out there? Is it a unique syndrome? And then kind of this idea of the diagnostic classification that we just don't have a great understanding of how we diagnose this across providers. So that being said, in the scientific field, I think there's lots of conversations about why this might not be a great diagnosis or why there's some concerns about using this diagnosis. But in the lay culture, we have seen an explosion of interest in this field. And so within the last several years, we've actually seen 14 books for parents and teachers published since 2000, which I realize is not within the last several years. But we also have seen 9 within the last 3 years. So the vast majority of publications that are coming out that are being published have actually happened within the recent history. And then we have 2 websites specifically dedicated to families and helping families understand and advocate for their children who might have these neurocognitive weaknesses. So I think that there's a lot of interest within the general population about this diagnosis, and I think there's a number of research groups that are trying to kind of make some headway in really understanding what is happening and how do we understand this as a diagnosis. So that being said, we've talked a lot about challenges. I've talked a lot about kind of the limited empirical support for this. There are many researchers and clinicians who will say there is a cognitive profile that includes the weaknesses that we've talked about. So the nonverbal or the visual-spatial weaknesses, the math difficulties, the fact that these kiddos present with social deficits that looks very different from an autism spectrum diagnosis, that we do see these motor weaknesses. So clinicians and researchers out there are understanding it, but I think that our understanding of nonverbal learning disability is likely going to expand in the future years as we continue to do more research in this area and recognize that parents and families have questions about this diagnosis and the applicability of it. So that being said, I think that because we recognize these weaknesses, one of the things that's really important to do is to talk about the interventions. So whether or not we call it a math learning disability, if we call it a visual constructional disability, what can you do to support your or your child's kind of weaknesses in these areas? So really we think about kind of the major areas of potential vulnerability. And so oftentimes we start with kind of the motor. We'll talk a little bit about the speech language, the academic, and the social. And within the context of each of these, I think it's really important to think about intervention in a couple of different ways. So we talk about, Sue Thompson has talked about this idea of CAMs. So compensation, accommodations, modifications, and strategies. So not looking at really just what we can make the child do differently, but how can we change the environment to better suit the child's needs or unique learning profile. So we first talk about motor interventions. So oftentimes, because I'm a neuropsychologist and I don't always have, I'm not an expert in fine motor skills, I will refer to my colleagues, occupational therapists, who have amazing exercises and skills and specific academic accommodations that I think can really help. So I think that any child where there's the consideration of a nonverbal learning disability should really be seen or work with an occupational therapist for further evaluation and intervention. But the general goal would be to reduce some of those fine motor demands. So within a classroom for school-age children, we would really advocate or recommend kind of note-taking support. So this could be as simple as the teacher providing a copy of the notes so that the student is able to, keep up with the lectures and doesn't struggle at being able to really understand what's happening and having to write down everything at the same time. We also talk about having a scribe, so as an individual kind of progresses through school and goes into a college setting, or on specifics kind of standardized testing, kind of advocating for someone who can write for them under timed conditions. And there's also a number of technology resources that are available for kiddos who might have some of those fine motor demands. So one would be something like a smart pen that kind of helps with in-class note-taking, and we'll talk about Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is kind of a dictation software, which can help reduce the motor demands of having to write out an essay. Dragon is an amazing tool, but does take a substantial amount of time to train, and so recognizing that it can be a useful tool, but we tend to recommend it for kiddos in later grades just because it can be so tricky to use. We also talk about allowing a child to orally present knowledge, so rather than having to write huge essays, giving a little speech to the class or having a presentation to the teacher so that they're able to convey what they know without really having to get bogged down with the writing aspect. Allowances to type assignments and keyboarding instruction, thinking that those are going to be ways to kind of compensate or work around some of those fine motor weaknesses. And then, of course, this idea of extended time. So knowing that kiddos who might have fine motor weaknesses are going to need extra time to complete writing assignments, they may need extra time at home to get dressed, that they may be someone who really struggles with buttons or zippers, and that rushing them in the morning might not be as exciting of an experience for everyone involved. Questions or thoughts so far? Are you guys hanging in there? All right, so academic interventions. So we talk about, for kiddos who really are exhibiting what we would consider a specific learning disability in mathematics, we would recommend additional instruction. And not just repeating the same kind of instruction that they've had within the general educational classroom, but really looking at modifying instruction. And within Colorado, and I'm not sure for a number of states outside of Colorado as well, what we're seeing is that we are using a math instructional pattern that's really heavily relying on visual-spatial skills. So for those of you families in Colorado, you may notice that your kiddo is drawing lots of little circles on some of their early math skills. And that specific kind of instruction, I've noticed that many of our families and many of our patients are struggling with, is kind of using visual representation of this numbers, that seems to bog them down even a little bit further. And so really helping teachers to recognize that these families or these patients might need, these students might need more or different kind of tailored instruction. So the idea of moving from a concrete or a physical representation to more abstract reasoning. So giving those manipulatives, allowing them to have some visual representation within a solid format that really helps them be able to generalize those math skills. Looking at relating new information to prior knowledge, so really helping them tie what they're learning in the moment to what they've learned in the past. Providing multiple opportunities to use math information to solve real-life problems. So tying it to baking, tying it to shopping, tying it to budgeting, those kind of functional academic skills that are a little bit easier to encode into your memory. There's also a couple of teaching strategies that we can look, so cover, copy, and compare, and what we call incremental rehearsal, which are kind of what they sound like. But this idea of kind of really teaching specific interventions and really helping individuals be able to learn that information within a context of a spiraling instructional strategy. So starting with one task, once they've mastered that, moving on to another, and then coming back and revisiting that information so that you're hopefully kind of solidifying those skills before you're going forward and not losing them over time. And then, of course, this idea of academic accommodations or modifications. So breaking down math concepts or math problems into individual steps, teaching and rehearsing those steps independently, creating a notebook so that the child can kind of refer back to that with a number of basic kind of mathematical procedures, and then providing kind of a math charts, kind of math facts chart or a calculator so that some of those basic rote math skills aren't things that hold the child back from learning some of the higher level math computations. We also, within this population, can see some evidence for difficulties with reading comprehension. So with those difficulties, it tends not to be the factual kind of information that's obtained through a passage, but it tends to be more the inferential questions that are asked. So it's what if, what would happen, what do you think, hypothesis testing, those kind of things, those tend to be the areas of vulnerability. And so really teaching strategies to help support reading comprehension. And a lot of it is just kind of developing questions about the story beforehand. So I'm going to read a story about butterflies. Kind of what kind of information might you expect? Kind of building a framework for you to be able to hang that information on, if you will. Review the chapter outlines and headings, so looking through and kind of getting an idea of what might we be paying attention to, what are going to be the main facts or the main topics of the information that we're going to read. Reading a summary and end of the chapter questions first so that you can kind of understand what information might be important to focus on. Identifying themes, pre-teaching any vocabulary words that you think might be new. So if there's any specific information that the child might not have had exposure to, being able to identify and help support the development of that skill before. And then learning to summarize important ideas. So this is something that we spend a fair amount of time on for kiddos in general education, but I think is something that, again, really that focus on making inferences and that non-literal interpretation of written exposure is going to be something that girls with Turner syndrome might benefit from more exposure, more focus on. And then reducing the amount of information that is expected to be processed or comprehended at one time. So if we know that a big book report is due in 2 weeks, we might not want to read it all the night before, but really allowing for this idea of kind of breaking it down and having good in-depth conversations about not only the factual information, but any of the concepts or themes that are presented. The other idea surrounds kind of these visual-spatial interventions that we can see. So again, what we talk about is when kiddos are struggling with visual-spatial deficits in the academic setting, what we can see the most notable difficulties with is interpretation of graphs and charts, keeping lines with math facts and things like that. And those can be the difficulties that we see as really the orientation of some of these problems. And so we talk about using not only a visual but an oral kind of component to these instructional strategies. So helping teach a child to talk through a visual graph so that they're able to understand the information that's being presented. Giving them kind of direct instruction in these compensatory strategies. So verbally explaining to support these activities that require complex visual spatial thoughts. We also talk about various methods to solve problems. So instead of just having the one method, really teaching them a number of different strategies. So, when you look at a graph, you could look at this, bar, you could look at this bar, it's going to tell you different information, and what would be a way to, what kinds of different information can you glean from a graph that might be helpful? Because you could say that 50% of people with this, disorder have learning problems, but 50% of this have math problems. And so how can you really look at that other information and kind of if you're thinking of like a bar chart or something like that, if that makes sense. And then we talked about kind of that modifications for both the motor and the visual spatial weaknesses. So note-taking support, keyboarding assistance, allowances to type assignments, and then using dictation software like Dragon Naturally Speaking. Some of the specific spatial vulnerabilities that we can see would be things that have been recommended by Sue Thompson, this idea of providing a verbal rope to help orient kiddos who might get lost within new kind of environments or new situations. So talking them through, hey, look, there's this picture on the wall right outside of your classroom, or you have to go to the third hallway. Look, it has green carpet. That's another way to kind of help them verbally orient themselves within a space so that they're able to kind of utilize those verbal cues when they might feel disoriented if they experience that in like a new school setting. We also talk about having a buddy that might be able to watch out and kind of direct them in new situations when they're going to the zoo or if they're on a field trip or recess to kind of be able to kind of help them get back where they need to be. And then rehearsing. So this is especially a big deal for kind of our middle school students who've, been in a small kind of nice environment in elementary school, and suddenly they're being asked to transition between classrooms, and really helping support that by having this repeated exposure to what that looks like and how they're able to kind of walk through these new environments and allowances to have that time ahead of schedule before they start on the first day. All right, guys, just keeping up with my notes here. So social skills are one of the main areas that have also been identified as potential areas. And again, it does feel like as a clinician, when you see these patients, that they look very different from patients who have an autism spectrum disorder. And the research has really suggested that there's varying results with that. So sometimes it looks like there's a lot of overlap, and other studies would say maybe not as much. But I think a lot of the social social skill interventions that we have designed as a field can be very effective for girls who have nonverbal learning disabilities, if that's appropriate. So one would be kind of therapeutic interventions like a friendship group at school, where a school counselor or mental health provider is able to really bring in a group of kiddos, some with social skills difficulties and some children who don't have those weaknesses, and really help them learn how to build good relationships. We talk about social stories. So social stories are kind of these therapeutic narratives that we help a child develop to address specific areas of vulnerability. So it may be that they tend to get bullied and they don't always recognize or know how to react to that. Or it may be, as someone gets older, that they just don't always seem to understand that someone might not have the best intentions. And so helping them kind of walk through, if someone says this to you, you should say this, and kind of giving them a script, if you will, to be able to respond to those statements. And then structured kind of play dates. So allowing your child to have someone in your home where you can kind of monitor and facilitate those good relationships with other peers, and recognizing that you might need to be a little bit more of a part of that than you would otherwise be. So we also talk about speech-language interventions. So again, a lot of these kiddos do quite well from a verbal standpoint. So we have really well-developed vocabulary, pretty good kind of understanding of basic kind of language-based academics like reading and spelling. But we do see this difficulty with pragmatic language and understanding kind of non-literal statements, as well as kind of the reading comprehension and social skills. And I think those three areas are where we can really draw on the literature and the support of our colleagues in the speech-language field, where they really are used to working with families and helping kiddos develop specific compensatory and compensatory strategies and intervention for these areas. I like to spend a little bit of time on just the literal interpretation. So I don't know, for those of you guys who have kiddos, or those of you who've experienced these situations in the past, of really understanding situations like hit the road, Jack, or I wasn't born yesterday, or some of those kind of statements that you can hear. What we think of is this idea, oh, thank you, perfect. Thanks. Explaining things that might be misinterpreted. So as a parent, the kid might be like, what? So thinking of, I have a little 3-year-old at home, and someone told him, gosh, it's just going to explode. And he was like, like, what? It's going to explode? And being like, oh, wait, that's not really what I mean. It's not going to explode. And stepping back and kind of talking through what you meant when you use that verbiage to help them be able to understand. Simplifying or breaking down those abstract concepts. So again, gosh, when I meant hit the road, Jack, I said, gosh, it's just time to go. We got to get out the door, and helping them understand that that's why you said that and what you meant when you said that. So rather than not using them, really just helping them understand what you're saying when you're using that non-literal language. Understanding metaphors, nuances in our emotional languages and multiple meanings, I think is something that may not be understood as readily, and so really taking the time and recognizing that as a potential area of vulnerability, and really helping the teachers see that as well, because especially as we get into some of the higher level academic readings, that becomes more of a common theme in some of the books, is really not taking the literature for face value, but really having to make these inferences or this understanding of these concepts or these themes that are running through the books that might not be as explicitly stated. And then teaching the child to advocate for herself, right? I don't understand what you mean when you say that. And giving her the words to be able to say that, and the ability to advocate when she's in a situation that might feel uncomfortable because she might know she's missing something but isn't quite sure what's been missed. And then giving her the vocabulary to help her just decipher kind of what you might have meant. So kind of using those problem-solving skills of, gosh, 2 birds in the, what is it? So a bird in the hand is worth more than 2 in the bush, right? So gosh, what does that mean? What do you think that means? Let's walk through that together. And giving her some of those problem-solving exercises rather than just completely staying away from them. All right, so then emotional interventions, and again, there's been varying levels of support, but we do tend to see anxiety as something that is commonly or at higher risk for girls with Turner syndrome. And so I think monitoring stress and anxiety, especially in academic settings, is something that's very important. Knowing that she might need more support as she has big transitions, so right before middle school, right before high school, at the beginning of the school year, recognizing that those can be areas of or times that are particularly stressful. And considering psychotherapeutic interventions when necessary. So if your child seems to be struggling, feeling like it's completely normal to reach out to mental health providers who can give you guys some ideas. You're amazing parents, right? You guys have all been here. You're doing a good job. But sometimes it's helpful to have other people on your team who can really give you some ideas that might not come readily to you while you're in the middle of the forest, right? And then ensure participation in activities that the child feels successful about. So we spend a lot of time talking about what we should do to strengthen areas of vulnerability, but I think it's equally as important to strengthen those skills that a child feels very successful and very competent in. And we don't spend as much time talking about that, but that's very important as well. So a couple of resources that are out there on the internet for you guys. So one would be nldline.com, and then a site that was established by Dr. Rourke before his passing that can be a helpful website to look at and kind of get some further information about how people are interpreting and feeling about nonverbal learning disability. In looking at those websites, several of them had very active family involvement, and so there's a number of resources and phone calls and talks that are presented throughout the year at a variety of different sites. And so if you're looking for ways to advocate for your child within your home state, that might be an option for you. Some books that have been kind of well received by the kind of community would be this Source for Nonverbal Learning Disorders. This is probably one of the most commonly referenced book. It's quite dated at this point, but I think it's still something that families are reporting that they feel pretty well supported in it. But there are a couple of more recent ones by Tanguay and Davis and Brittman that might be have more recent research, if that could be helpful for you guys. And then some references for all the scientific literature that I made you guys suffer through. So I will leave some of the books up because I think that's probably one of the most helpful situations. And we do have a little bit of time for questions, I think, right? So about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so I don't know if you guys have any specific questions or thoughts about presentation at all. Yes? Okay. Oh, okay.
And I asked the teacher about NLD, and she seems to have, is there a step that I should take with the teachers, or what can we do to help?
So I think that's a great question. So I think for any time before we would see a child held back, we would have liked to see an evaluation of some kind to say, what are her learning strengths and weaknesses? And is she having trouble? Why is she having trouble staying seated in her chair? I think that having an evaluation with a neuropsychologist or a developmental kind of psychologist would probably be a really good fit at this point, so that you can understand not only what her thinking skills are, but also what her academic and kind of those visual spatial weaknesses are, and as well as her attention. So it sounds like some of that motor restlessness that you're experiencing or that you're seeing in class for her, are you seeing it at home as well? Okay, yeah. Sure. Okay. And so there's lots of potential hypotheses, if you will. So kiddos who are anxious look very fidgety. Kiddos who are young have a wide range of normal kind of motor activity. But we also would be potentially concerned about kind of a diagnosis of an attentional disorder. And that, medicate, I think people think, oh my gosh, you're going to tell me to medicate my child. And that's never the first place we go with young children. And so really looking at structuring kind of the environment and giving good behavioral strategies strategies so that we're able to support her attention within the classroom. And then knowing that attention to task is so highly correlated to academic success, if we're not able to regulate those attentional behaviors or that impulsivity or hyperactivity, if you will, better, then looking at kind of the other potential psychopharmacological interventions that might be available for you. But at this stage, I would really encourage you to consider kind of reaching out to a neuropsychologist, and I'm happy to help you find that if that would be beneficial. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have an idea what the percentage of classic Turner girls that end up being diagnosed with this is, and about what age do they get diagnosed?
Those are excellent questions. The literature that I know wouldn't suggest that we have that well developed of an understanding of this diagnosis at this point. And because I think it's that discrepancy between the criteria that's been used, and I don't think that we've seen as much research into specific diagnoses in terms of base rates and things like that at this point. My thought about the age of diagnosis was that it's probably more likely to occur as math difficulties become more obvious, and so we oftentimes, again, because there is such a wide range of normal in preschool and kindergarten kids in terms of math concepts, that I could see, later identification of math learning disabilities and then kind of seeing some of those concepts that would fall into place as well. But I don't know if we have great literature about that. Yes?
Is it possible for someone to have this and not have a big issue with math? Because my daughter seems to have everything else.
Except the math learning disability.
Yeah, she doesn't do so well in math because she just struggles with school in general. But if
Yeah.
she has the ability to work on it, she does.
She does okay. So I think that you're highlighting one of this idea is, are there subtypes, right? Are there people that struggle with, the visual spatial but not the math? Are there people that struggle with the math but not the social? And I think that one of the things that's really important to recognize about Turner syndrome is that it may just be that the diagnosis alone is enough for us to say that we know that these cognitive weaknesses are associated. And so do we need another diagnosis? And there's been some argument in the field to say, isn't this medical diagnosis enough? And oftentimes, that's how I advocate for families within special education teams, is not to say let's call this a specific learning disability, but that let's call this other health impaired, which is that special educational classification that I think helps us be able to capture the constellation of weaknesses. So not only the math learning disability, whether or not it's present, but also the visual spatial risks, some of the motor concerns, and then the social stuff that I don't oftentimes think falls into an autism diagnosis, and oftentimes they're not meeting criteria for an autism diagnosis. So that is usually how we're reaching out and kind of trying to advocate for the families within the Colorado setting as well, as at least.
I did need that when we did her 504 plan, they did, because I don't think they know what this is, so they did just put down she has Turner syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that in a lot of ways is the easiest way to advocate as a family, right? But we could have some additional information as we keep going and learning more about this diagnosis. Yes, ma'am.
You said that, the concept of time can be challenging. Do you know of any strategies to help them develop that?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and probably a question that I would refer back to some of the educational teachers and tutors about, because I think teaching time is something that we spend a fair amount of time on in kind of early grades, and so I think kind of referring back to some of those providers and asking what we can do. I would think about like the visual spatial demands of that, right? So teaching someone kind of that traditional clock and recognizing that it might be really hard shorthand, longhand, which one's pointing where, that maybe just going to a more digital kind of
Well, she can tell time, but the concept
of how long.
and now you have
Yes.
to know that she's freaking out
That she doesn't have enough time. That, I think, can include a lot of executive functioning skills, perhaps, so planning and organization and kind of recognizing, how long did this task take me in the past, how long is it going to take me in the future, and that kind of a topic, I think, would be like a whole nother lecture, quite frankly, in terms of those executive functioning skills. But there are a couple of books. So the Smart But Scattered series is one of the great kind of books to look at executive functioning skills. I don't know if they have specific interventions or accommodations for time instruction, but that would be kind of where I would refer to in terms of a parent-friendly kind of way to think about executive functioning strategies. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry.
Back to the school setting.
Yes.
My daughter has an IEP that she's had since preschool.
Uh-huh.
So she's entering third grade, so it's still in effect.
Mm-hmm.
But every year at our annual meeting,
Right.
They've worked with me and they've come up with things to work on. So
Sure.
it's OT and speech at school.
Sure.
But rather than just going in there and blabbering all that, should I just leave it at Turner syndrome, or should I try to come up with one of those 13 diagnoses that were on the list?
Right. So that's what we advocate for other health impaired.
So I
Yeah.
should say that as other health impaired.
Yeah, so I actually formally trained as a school psychologist. I spent a fair amount of time sitting on the other side of the table in terms of IEP meetings, and I think that there are boxes that have to be checked, and there is not a box for NLD. And there's a box for math learning disability, but that's only a piece of the puzzle for a lot of these students. And so I think that really going under the classification of other health impaired opens up the door for more interventions, and it also, thank you, thanks so much. And it also, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It also it's going to minimize the battle that you're going to have every year, because her other health impaired category is never going to change, right?
That's been my fear.
Yeah.
As soon as she meets the goal set by the speech
Mhm.
person in the OT, they're going to be like, okay,
Yep,
discharge.
she's good.
What else are you going to come up with, lady?
Right,
We
right.
help you.
Yeah, so I think it's harder to discontinue an IEP with another health impaired diagnosis, has been my experience. If a child is doing academically well and we don't think that they need the accommodations any longer, then it is harder to advocate for an IEP. But if we know that she has these consistent cognitive vulnerabilities, which are not seen in every kiddo with Turner syndrome, but if that is something that she continues to exhibit, and we think that there's a direct influence on how well she can do academically, then I think there's a lot of support to continue an IEP. But the other health impaired seems to be, in my personal experience, an easier way to advocate for continuation of those services rather than the specific learning disability. Yes, ma'am.
So we're considering starting our daughter when she turns 5 in a dual language program.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking just because her verbal skills seem to
Sure.
be
Yeah, yeah.
like that would be an asset for her, or do you think that that would hurt her math?
So I wouldn't think that it should hurt her math. And I mean, I think that I would want to make sure that she has some additional focus on math and she's getting some good evidence-based instruction in math. But
Math is taught in Spanish or in the other language.
oh,
First, they like start at 90% Spanish, 10% English, and each year they have a 10% increase in English.
okay. And so some of the programs that I'm aware of in Colorado have like half-day programs where in the morning it's dual language, and then some of the afternoon programs, like specific concepts like math, are taught in English. That doesn't sound like that's the program she's thinking about?
Colorado, but that's not my understanding of it.
Okay, okay. So, I mean, one option would be to give it a try and to see how it goes, and then to supplement with some math instruction at home, either kind of individually or kind of hiring kind of a tutor to make sure that she's just continuing to acquire those concepts at a rate that you might expect. But I think that dual language would play to some of her verbal strengths and is a great asset to have as you're going forward as an adult. So I wouldn't say don't do it. I would just say be very mindful and keep a very close eye. And all schools are required to do kind of curriculum-based measurement, and so you'll be able to see how she's doing compared to her peers on math. And if she starts to seem like she's not making the progress we would expect, or you're seeing a decline, then that would be when I would encourage you to maybe seek out other resources or consider a change of schools. And then I know I missed you last time, so I'm going to jump.
I just had a comment.
Yeah. About the what? I'm sorry?
About the not being able to get the concept of time.
Oh, okay.
My daughter's the same way, and what I've done is relate it to a TV show that they watch.
Oh, nice.
Like say this takes 1 Wildcats long, or 2 Wildcats, or whatever it is that I can watch.
I like that strategy. That's nice. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else have any other questions or thoughts? All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I know it's a difficult topic.